do you deal with, or how do you be obedient to emotionally abusive parents? Now, before you answer the question, I want you to help us first qualify, because a lot of times what somebody might be like, oh, that's emotionally abusive, might not be, or they're just, scolding them, right? Versus something actually being emotionally abusive. So if you can help clarify and define, qualify what that means.
I think that, these terms are in need of being qualified, and they're also case by case. So sometimes there are people that are verbally abusive, but, there's a fine line between someone who's being a jerk and someone who's actually like hurting and harming and causing serious harm with their words. I think that you start from the place that, it's become really hard to talk about these issues in public because everyone has a very
personal story.
Yeah. And then they hear a khutbah about obedience to parents and they say,
like,
what about emotionally abusive parents?
Yeah,
it's like, well, the Quran and the Sunnah are addressing the default, which is that Allah has given the parents a right over the child, a particular honor over the child, just like the default is that they brought you into this world, and so they have rights over you and honor them, and that's something that we should take seriously. Now, but the exceptions are there.
Yeah. And
like there's a story from Omar al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, where a young man was brought by his father, and the father was complaining about him. And then the young man actually had his own grievances, and Omar radiallahu anhu said that the father had hurt him or foregone his rights before he could have any rights claimed back from him. So there are times where even in the Salaf, for the pious predecessors, someone like Umar al-Khattab, where he's like, well, no, you have no right to complain about your child because of what you've done to your child. Right. So the best way to deal with this is usually for someone to actually talk to both parties. Okay. And to see, where the lines have been crossed. And
so there's got to be a detailed look, because somebody might be like, oh, my parents are being emotionally abusive, but then it's a question of like, maybe maybe it is abuse if a child has never been scolded in their life before. No, and
but there are, you don't want to diminish emotional abuse. Sometimes emotional abuse can even be worse than physical abuse.
Well, what are some cases that you've kind of come across where something is like, oh yeah, this was emotionally abusive?
Well, sometimes a parent constantly making remarks about their child's weight. Okay. To a point that they're calling them names, calling them,
Okay. Basically make it like they may not actually be fat or obese, especially in the case of women. Right. And like they're
you have parents that are really insensitive and that go on their kids, and they're just really, really too much with it. Right. So they'll even make comments about their food and make comments about their appearance, and no one's ever going to want to marry you, and no one's
things like that.
So that's really abusive. Right. And that can have serious detrimental effects emotionally, psychologically, and things of that sort. So
I feel like the parent or the adult that does that don't even recognize that they're being abusive.
Right. So that's why counsel, sometimes they do. And a lot of times they think it's actually to the benefit of the child. Yeah. And they're taking out frustrations on the child. So, and it just becomes too much for the child to bear. So the child is in fact a recipient of emotional abuse, but the parents don't recognize that they're doing that. And they think that what they're doing is to the benefit of the child. Now, at the end of the day, having counselors and therapists and people actually sit and sort of sort that all out, is something that's very important. There are Islamic guidelines to it, and then Islamic guidelines sort of guide certain elements, and then there's the psychiatric and the counseling and the therapy part of this, which is like, okay, if it's reached this point, how do we actually solve this?
But the thing though, the challenge, especially people of an immigrant disposition, rarely, especially the adults, will rarely ever even consider the thought of going to therapy or going to a counselor.
Yeah, so there are layers, right? Yeah. So there is, talking to an aunt or an uncle or someone that the parents can relate to.
Okay. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a professional counselor.
Not for every case. No. Okay. Not for every case. Yeah. I mean, it's the ideal, but I mean, there's financial cost to that. There's time. There's getting buy-in from everybody. It's hard to get everyone to it. I think we need to remove the stigma around that as a Muslim community, because that's part of growth is to actually have someone help you sort through those types of things. But, I mean, I think that the point of this is certainly that, you need to try to find ways to mitigate this as much as you can, and have an aunt and uncle, someone step in and at least maybe shatter the idea that I'm doing nothing wrong. Yeah. That nothing's abusive about this. I'm not saying anything, and often, the justification will come, my parents did this to me. Right. Like the way I'm talking to my kids, if they saw the way my parents talked to me, and, that's not the best way to resolve. That's not the litmus test or this. And sometimes, a child will say they're being emotionally abused, and it's not really emotional abuse, right? And that's something that can be, deciphered once it's sort of all brought out there, and serious discussions can happen about it. So I think that the point is that, everyone has a very unique situation, but generally speaking, it's better to solve this. So even if a child feels like they're being emotionally abused, even if it's not really emotional abuse, that should be enough to warrant a parent willing to sit down with someone to sort of help sort through the situation.
Gotcha. Now, there's this idea of silatul rahim, right, which is goodness towards parents. Where does that line begin and end in the context of emotional abuse?
Well, if there's an imminent threat or danger or harm, which is usually in the realm of the physical, right, then that's where, it's permissible as it's a rukhsa for a person to it's a concession to that very particular person to sort of omit that and to do what they have to do to take heed and to protect themselves, right? When it's in the realm of the verbal, then I think, as a child, I'd still want to fix it with my parents, right? I can't just give up on that because that relationship is far too sacred. So then the doctrine of silatul rahim will be invoked, of maintaining ties will be invoked, not to say tolerate the emotional abuse, but try to find a way to make it work with your parents, making them aware of the emotional abuse and still wanting to honor that link that you have with them.
So this will kind of require that there be a healthy level of communication between the parent and the child.
Right.
If that doesn't exist, it's going to be very difficult to be able to achieve that, though, right?
Yeah, and then that becomes the problem. That's what needs to be alluded to. That look, we're not able to talk. We're having major communication issues. And again, you're right. A lot, particularly in the immigrant community, would be really resistant to any type of counseling. Like, what are you talking about counseling?
Yeah.
But I do think that you might be able to find someone sympathetic to you within the family corpus or within the family itself that can then go and talk to that person and at least bring it to a conversation and start the conversation.
So essentially, if we were to sum this up, step one would be to be like, all right, you know what? This is a problem, right? I'm as a child, I'm affected by this. Can we talk about it, right? And if you can achieve that, then perhaps there could be an understanding to be made or to be met where the parent could be like, hey, you know what? That wasn't nice of me. That wasn't parental of me, right? And so I guess the question now is for anybody who's going through what they might deem as emotional abuse, the first place to start would be to have that initial conversation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.